4:18 a.m., March 3, 1943, Huon Gulf, off the northern coast of New Guinea. The sky was a heavy lid of tropical clouds, smothering the moonlight and leaving only a faint glimmer across the restless surface of the sea. Somewhere in that darkness, a Japanese convoy of 16 ships crawled westward, packed with troops, ammunition, fuel, and the supplies that would keep their grip on New Guinea alive. And every intelligence officer in the 5th Air Force knew the awful truth. Hitting these convoys had become almost impossible. The situation report that morning said it plainly. High-altitude bombing was ineffective, low-altitude attacks resulted in catastrophic losses, and 11 A-20 bombers had gone down in just 2 weeks. At 12 to 15,000 feet, bombs drifted hundreds of yards off target. The tropical winds tossed them aside long before they ever reached a ship. But going low meant flying straight into storms of 25mm autocannon fire that tore through aluminum wings like a carpenter's drill bit through soft pine. Pilots described the tracers coming at them like strings of burning pearls, and by the time they saw them, the rounds were already hitting. It was a perfect trap. Drop high and miss, drop low and die, do nothing, and watch the Japanese reinforce every island they wanted. The war diary of the 5th Air Force even admitted something almost heretical. We are losing the logistics war, and everyone knew what that meant. If Japan kept its shipping lanes alive, New Guinea would fall. And if New Guinea fell, the Pacific campaign would stretch into hellish years. Something had to change, and fast. Enter 2nd Lieutenant Paul "Gun" Weaver, a 24-year-old Kansas-born pilot whose hands still carried the memory of his father's machine shop. Paul was not a theorist, not a tactical prodigy, not an academic mind. He was a mechanic who had learned early that if a tool wasn't doing its job, you changed the tool. And when he looked at the B-25 bombers on the ramp, glass-nosed, spacious, elegant machines, he didn't see a bomber. He saw wasted potential. He saw something that could be reshaped into a weapon no one had asked for, but everyone desperately needed. So when yet another Japanese convoy slipped through untouched, Paul said the sentence that would rewrite the Pacific. If bombs won't hit ships, then we stop using bombs. At first, his squadron thought he was joking, but he walked right up to the nose of a B-25, tapped its plexiglass bombardier enclosure and said, "This is wasted space. What we need is firepower, forward firepower." And then he laid out his idea, one so wild no engineer would sign on to it. Replace the glass nose with a reinforced steel block, mount 8 50-caliber Browning machine guns inside it, add 6 more along the fuselage sides, load over 5,000 rounds of ammunition, strip out the bombardier station entirely. And then, instead of attacking from altitude, sweep in low, 50 feet above the ocean, and overwhelm enemy ships with sheer fire instead of gravity. Most men laughed. Some stared at him as if he had lost his mind. One captain flat out told him, "Weaver, that's not a bomber. That's a suicide note with wings." But Paul wasn't joking. He'd watched strafing runs from P-38s and A-20s. He'd seen what 50-caliber bullets did to unarmored ship decks. Fuel lines burst open. Ammunition crates erupted. Gun crews vanished in sprays of metal and smoke. Bullets didn't drift in the wind. Bullets didn't miss by 100 yards. Bullets hit what you pointed at. And Paul realized something no one else had dared to say out loud. Bombs were the wrong tool. The B-25 needed to become something different, a flying destroyer. But when he submitted his proposal through proper channels, it didn't survive 2 days. Wright Field Engineering Command rejected the idea immediately. Concept not feasible. Recoil forces exceed tolerance. Structural deformation likely. Tactical value unproven. One engineer even scribbled in the margin, "This is fantasy," and that should have been the end of it. But Paul Weaver was not built for quitting. If the official solution didn't work, he would build a new one, without permission. So he recruited 2 men he trusted, Sergeant Milton Hayes and Corporal Elias Rivera, both mechanics who understood the strange mixture of genius and madness in Paul's voice. And one night, with the hangar doors cracked just enough to hide their work, the 3 of them tore the nose off a B-25. They gutted it down to the ribs, stripping out the bombardier's position and the Norden bomb site. They welded steel braces salvaged from a wrecked truck. They cut mounting rails with torches borrowed from the motor pool. They fashioned a steel nose block from scrap plating. Every step was unauthorized. Every component was improvised. Every hour they worked was a violation of Air Corps protocol. But the result was real. A B-25 with 14 forward-firing 50-caliber guns, braced with makeshift steel, wired into a master firing switch, holding nearly 6,000 rounds of ammunition. On the nose, Paul chalked 4 words: "This plane kills ships." The next morning, Captain Ross stormed into the hangar. "Lieutenant Weaver, what in God's name have you done?" he shouted. Paul didn't even flinch. Ross climbed the ladder, saw the welded steel, the removed instruments, the gutted bombardier's compartment. "You were given a rejection," Ross barked. Paul simply said, "That was the theoretical design. This is the real one." Ross threatened disciplinary action. Paul accepted the risk. "If I'm wrong, I die," he said. "If I'm right, we save New Guinea." Ross stared at him, jaw tight, and walked out without shutting them down. It wasn't approval, but it was permission enough. At 3:12 a.m. the next night, under pounding rain, Paul powered up the modified B-25. The guns roared to life in a single deafening blast. The recoil shook the plane so violently the wheels almost lifted. But the nose held, the frame held, the guns fired clean. Hayes shouted through the smoke, "It's holding! It's actually holding!" And for the first time, Paul allowed himself a grin. Tomorrow, he would take the world's first B-25 gunship into combat, and either it would change the Pacific War or it would kill him. 1542 hours, May 25, 1943, Batiaz Strait. The sky was an angry sheet of storm clouds, the kind that turned daylight into bruised twilight. Rain hammered the windshield so hard it sounded like gravel hitting glass. The B-25 shuddered in the crosswinds, but Paul Weaver held it steady, pushing the aircraft lower and lower over the heaving Pacific. 60 feet, 40, 30. At this altitude, the sea felt close enough to reach out and touch. Behind him, Rivera's voice crackled nervously over the intercom. "Sir, we are too damn low." But Paul didn't budge. Down here, he was slipping beneath the instincts of Japanese gunners trained to aim higher. Down here, the bomber-turned-gunship was becoming a predator. Then the convoy emerged through a break in the storm. 7 transport ships and 5 destroyers, moving in tight formation. Their wakes carved white scars behind them. Hayes leaned toward the side window and whispered, "That's a lot of ships." Paul said nothing. He simply flipped open the red safety guard on the master firing switch. The Japanese destroyer Hatsukase saw him first. A curtain of tracers erupted across the sky, blazing orange lines slicing toward the B-25. The gunners aimed too high initially, expecting a bomber at the usual altitude. But Paul came in like a torpedo, 30 feet above the waves, engines howling, the wind screaming across the fuselage. The destroyer's guns adjusted, pouring fire directly into his path. Any rational pilot would have climbed away. Paul pushed the throttles forward. He charged through the wall of gunfire, aligning his nose with a 4,000-ton Notori-class transport. At 800 yards, the ship filled the windscreen. At 500 yards, the tracers grew thick enough that Hayes yelled, "We're gonna get hit!" At 300 yards, Paul whispered, "Let's make history," and pulled the trigger. The world detonated. 14 Browning machine guns unleashed a hurricane of lead, turning the cockpit into a flickering furnace as muzzle flashes strobed across the steel nose. The recoil shook the plane violently, but the welded structure held. Rounds slammed into the transport's bow in a torrent, armor-piercing bullets tearing through the deck, incendiary rounds igniting fuel lines, tracers carving glowing scars across the hull. A forward gun mount exploded in a blossom of fire. Japanese sailors scattered in panic. Smoke billowed upward in thick black rolls. "It's working!" Rivera screamed. "Holy hell, it's working!" Paul banked sharply, skimming past the burning vessel as a secondary explosion ripped it open. Ammunition stores going up. That was the first kill. He didn't stop. He dropped his left wing until sea spray blasted the canopy and lined up the next target, a smaller Daihatsu transport. A half-second burst shredded it from bow to stern. Flames climbed its mast. Men hurled themselves into the water. Another kill. But the Japanese were adapting. The destroyer T-141 swung around and opened fire, its gunners frighteningly accurate. A tracer smashed through the B-25's nose plating. Another tore through the right engine cowling. Then, a 13mm round punched through the windshield and ripped a burning path across Paul's shoulder. Blood sprayed across the control panel. Hayes shouted, "Lieutenant, you're hit!" Paul gritted his teeth. His left arm quivered, but he forced it steady. "I'm not done," he growled. He steered straight for the destroyer. Tracers flew so thick they looked like fiery rain. The engines roared. The B-25 shook under the onslaught. At 600 yards, Paul squeezed the trigger again. The forward guns spat fire in a continuous stream. The rounds ripped into the destroyer's bridge, shredding crew, detonating fuel drums, tracing a line of explosions down the deck. A massive blast erupted midships, throwing debris into the air. The T-141 staggered, aflame from bow to stern. Paul yanked the yoke upward, climbing away just as the destroyer began listing heavily to port. The B-25 coughed smoke. Panels rattled. The right landing gear strut was half sheared. Inside, Rivera checked the ammo feeds and choked out, "Sir, we're dry." They had fired every single round. Paul turned toward home. The battered plane limped through the storm, running on one good engine and sheer stubbornness. When they touched down at WWII, the right tire burst, and the aircraft skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust and steam. Ground crews sprinted forward, then froze in awe. The nose plating was blistered from heat. The guns were scorched black. The fuselage was pocked with dozens of holes, and yet, impossibly, it had survived. The tests were over. The gunship worked. And that was only the beginning. Over the next 72 hours, Paul led 3 more missions. Each one pushed the limits of the aircraft. Each one tore through Japanese shipping with terrifying efficiency. By the end of the 3rd day, the tally was undeniable. 12 ships sunk, 17 more damaged, a major convoy destroyed, and an entire supply line severed. Rumors spread across the Pacific like wildfire. The Americans had a new weapon, a bomber that chewed through ships like a sea monster rising from below the waves. The Japanese had no idea how to respond. They had never seen a bomber behave this way. They had never seen firepower like this at sea level. And they had never imagined that a single aircraft could turn a convoy into a scrapyard. Back at WWII, Paul was pale from blood loss, his shoulder stitched, his arms strapped tight, but his eyes were alive. The idea he had risked everything for, the idea everyone had dismissed, was now proving itself in the most undeniable way possible, with burning ships and sinking hulls. What he didn't know was that the highest ranks of the 5th Air Force were already on their way to see the weapon that was rewriting the rules. WWII Airfield was buzzing the morning after the 3rd mission. Not loud, not chaotic, but charged. Mechanics gathered around Paul's B-25 as if it were some mythical creature dragged out of the ocean. Pilots whispered in tight circles. Officers passed around damage reports with expressions somewhere between disbelief and fear. 12 ships sunk, 17 damaged, not a single bomb dropped. A bomber turning entire convoys into floating wreckage simply wasn't something anyone had seen before, not even in theory. And yet the proof was sitting right there on the tarmac, its steel nose charred black, its guns still warm from hellish overuse, its skin riddled with holes, but alive. On June 2nd, Major General George Kenny arrived unannounced. His transport barely touched down before word spread across the base. Kenny was not the type of man who traveled for small matters. He was a results man, brutal about failure, fiercely loyal to success. When he stepped off the aircraft, he didn't waste a second. He walked straight toward the scorched B-25 where Paul stood waiting, arm in a sling, shoulder aching with every heartbeat. Kenny walked around the aircraft in silence, trailing a hand along the welded steel plates, peering into the gutted bombardier compartment, inspecting the improvised brackets, as if trying to determine whether this thing was madness or miracle. Finally, he turned to Paul and said, "Lieutenant Weaver, did you build this in defiance of a direct engineering rejection?" Paul nodded. "Yes, sir." Kenny stared for a moment, then smiled. A rare, sharp smile. "Good," he said. "We're going to build 100 more." That was it, the line in the sand. What had been unauthorized, illegal, and wildly experimental became official U.S. Army Air Force's doctrine in a single sentence. Hours later, Kenny was airborne again, heading for headquarters with a message that traveled faster than any bomber. Authorize immediate B-25 gunship conversions. Weaver's design works. Back in the United States, the engineers at Wright Field reopened the very proposal they had once dismissed as fantasy. Now it was gospel. The steel nose was redesigned in proper materials. The 8-gun forward battery was standardized. New cannon variants were tested. And a new model designation appeared. B-25G, the world's first production gunship bomber. The irony was almost poetic. The same engineers who had scribbled "impossible" in the margins now used Paul's improvised field modifications as a blueprint. The downward 6-degree gun offset? Paul's idea. The internal reinforcement plating? Paul's idea. The extended ammo feeds? Paul again. Even the removal of the bombardier station, once called reckless, was now a requirement. But Paul himself never asked for credit. He didn't want promotion or a new office or a safer assignment. He wanted to keep flying the aircraft he had created. He flew 09345 until it was too damaged to remain in service, then flew its replacements. And he flew them low, always low, carving gunfire across enemy supply lines in New Guinea, the Bismarck Sea, and the Philippines. He became a ghost story among Japanese convoys, the bomber that came out of the storm, spitting fire. But machines, no matter how well built, do not last forever. On November 6, 1944, during operations supporting the Leyte landings, Paul's B-25 was hit by concentrated fire from Japanese fighters. Witnesses saw the right engine ignite into a spinning ball of flame. But even then, Paul didn't break away. He kept firing. He kept protecting the transports below. He kept fighting the way he always had, with everything in him. When the fire finally overcame the aircraft, it spiraled into the sea near Ormoc Bay. Search efforts found nothing. No crew, no wreckage. Only the widening ripple of a man who had changed the war. His squadron carved a plaque from a chunk of armor pulled off a destroyed Japanese ship. They mounted it in their hangar. No speeches, no ceremony. Just a line of carved letters. A-10 Paul Weaver, the man who turned a bomber into a fleet killer. He never received the fame of a top ace. No magazine covers, no medals pinned to a uniform. But his legacy flew in every gunship that followed, and what followed was enormous. Paul's field-borne idea didn't just create the B-25G, it became the foundation for an entire family of aircraft that would dominate the skies for decades. The AC-47 Spooky in Vietnam, side-firing miniguns designed for sustained fire on point targets, was built on Paul's philosophy. The AC-119 followed, and then the AC-130, the most feared close air support aircraft in the world, loaded with Gatling guns, cannons, and 105mm artillery, all of them driven by the same principle Paul proved that morning in the Vityaz Strait. Overwhelming, precise firepower changes everything. Even the A-10 Thunderbolt II, the tank-busting Warthog, carries Paul's DNA. It isn't a bomber, it's a gun with wings, just like his B-25. The ripple effect didn't stop at equipment. Doctrine changed too. Low-level strafing became a core tactic for anti-shipping missions. Close air support embraced the philosophy of precision by volume. The idea that a single aircraft could deliver devastating, sustained fire became a defining element of American air power. And it all began with a lieutenant in a jungle hangar who ignored every rule because the rules weren't saving lives. Strategically, the effects were just as profound. Because of Paul's creation, the 5th Air Force increased its success rate against Japanese shipping by more than 300%. Entire convoy routes were abandoned. Supply lines collapsed. Island fortifications weakened. Thousands of Allied soldiers who would have been starved, surrounded, or overrun survived because Japanese reinforcements never arrived. More than 2,500 gunship variants of the B-25 were built or converted, a number that would have been unimaginable before Paul's first mission. And through it all, one quiet truth emerged. Innovation never starts in the boardroom. It starts with someone on the ground, someone whose life is on the line, someone who refuses to accept that the current solution is the best solution. Paul Weaver didn't invent a gunship. He invented a mindset. The mindset that says, if the official answer doesn't work, build a better one. The story of Paul Weaver doesn't end with the crash at Ormoc Bay. It doesn't end with his name in a war diary or a clipped commendation letter filed in some forgotten cabinet. It ends with the truth his life carved into the Pacific. The truth that innovation comes not from safety, not from committees, not from engineers cloistered in offices, but from the men who face death first. Paul wasn't a general or a theorist. He wasn't a man who delivered sweeping speeches or wrote long tactical analyses. He was a pilot with steel shavings in his hair, a mechanic with a habit of ignoring the word impossible, a soldier who understood that if the tool wasn't good enough, you reinvented the tool. And that is precisely what he did. When bombs missed, he chose bullets. When altitude killed, he flew low. When doctrine failed, he wrote a new one with sparks and metal. His gunship didn't just sink ships, it sank the old way of thinking. The final lesson of Paul Weaver's life is brutally simple. Innovation is born where failure becomes unacceptable. When the Japanese convoys kept slipping through, when Allied forces on New Guinea were starving for supplies, when 11 A-20s had gone down in 2 weeks for almost no effect, there was no time left for committees or paperwork. There was only time to act, only time to build something that might work, before hundreds more lives were lost. Paul's superiors called his design unsound. They said the recoil would rip the plane apart. They said the structure couldn't take the stress. They said there was no tactical value in what he proposed. But those men never flew 30 feet above the sea into a wall of tracers. They didn't watch bombs fall harmlessly into empty water. They didn't see comrades shot down by fire they could have avoided. Paul saw all of that. And because he saw it, he understood what the engineers never could. The war didn't need theoretical perfection. It needed immediate, functional brutality. And the numbers leave no room for argument. 12 ships sunk, 17 damaged, and a major convoy obliterated in 72 hours. New supply routes cut. Japanese reinforcements stalled. The New Guinea front stabilized. More than 12,000 Allied troops, men who would have been overrun, encircled, or starved, lived because the supply lines feeding the Japanese collapsed. The entire strategic arc of the southwestern Pacific shifted. A single aircraft, modified in defiance of the rulebook, tilted the war, and the ripple never stopped. The B-25G and H models were built in the thousands. The doctrine spread. Strafing became a primary tactic. The gunship concept grew wings of its own. In Vietnam, gunships circled villages like guardian spirits, raining precise fire from their side-mounted guns. AC-47s and AC-119s drew their lineage directly from Paul's creation. The AC-130, the most feared precision-firing aircraft in the world, embodied every principle he proved true over the Vityaz Strait. And then the A-10 arrived, a flying cannon built around the philosophy that firepower solves what finesse cannot. Paul Weaver would never see these aircraft, never hear the deep drum roll of a GAU-8 cannon, never watch an AC-130 slice apart a target with impossible accuracy. But his fingerprints rest on all of them. His idea became their bloodline. But perhaps the most powerful legacy is the one that doesn't appear in military inventories or battlefield reports. It is the legacy of memory, the quiet, fragile, easily lost memory of the men who imagine things others consider madness. Men who see what everyone else sees but refuse to accept it. In every war, there are brilliant innovations that never make it into the history books. There are pilots who rewired their aircraft on the runway to squeeze out a little more speed. Mechanics who welded scrap metal into life-saving armor plates. Gunners who modified their mounts to fire just a little faster. Officers who broke orders because following them would have meant losing the fight. These people rarely get monuments. They rarely get their names engraved into stone, yet they change everything. Paul was one of them. When his plane went down at Leyte, his squadron left his bunk untouched for weeks. His tools stayed hanging in the corner of the hangar, still smeared with grease. His name was spoken in briefings with the kind of quiet reverence soldiers reserve for the men who never came home. And in the center of the hangar, mounted on a plaque carved from the armor of a sunken Japanese vessel, stood the line that captured his entire life. He built what was needed. Not what was authorized, not what was approved, what was needed. And now the responsibility rests with us. Stories like Paul Weaver's do not survive on their own. They vanish. They fade between the pages of military reports, tucked behind more famous battles and more celebrated names. They die unless someone chooses to carry them forward. Because somewhere out there, in another war or another crisis, another young pilot or engineer or mechanic will face a problem that the rulebook can't solve. And if they've never heard of the men who broke rules to save lives, they may never realize that they're allowed to do the same. That they're allowed to question, to adapt, to innovate, to refuse the unacceptable, to build what is needed. So consider this not just a story, but a responsibility. Every time you see an AC-130 circling above a conflict zone, every time you hear the thunderous cough of an A-10 releasing its cannon, every time you watch archival footage of gunships tearing across a battlefield, remember where it began. Remember the lieutenant who welded a bomber into a destroyer in a rain-soaked jungle hangar. Remember the man who turned defiance into doctrine and improvisation into history. Remember Paul Weaver, and remember the lesson he left behind. If the world forgets the innovators of yesterday, the innovators of tomorrow may never be born.